Black Harbor was the kind of place that held its secrets tightly. The kind of place where the air always felt heavy, as though it carried the weight of too many stories left untold. But for Ella Monroe, it wasn't the secrets of Black Harbor she cared about, it was her own. Ella arrived in the coastal town on a rainy November evening, her old Jeep groaning under the strain of a cross-country trek and a lifetime of baggage she couldn't quite leave behind. A new job, a fresh start, at least, that was what she told herself. But she felt it the moment she crossed into town, an electric hum beneath her skin, a flicker of something just out of reach. Her new home wasn't much to look at. A century-old house on the edge of the cliffs, overlooking an ocean that roared louder than her own thoughts. The real estate agent had seemed almost too eager to hand over the keys. "It's been on the market for years," the woman had said, her smile stretched too wide. "People around here are just superstitious." Superstition didn't scare Ella. At least, it hadn't. Not until that first night. The power went out as the last box hit the floor. A flicker, then darkness. Ella fumbled for her phone, the dim glow of the flashlight catching something in the corner of the room, just for a moment. A figure. A man. Standing there. Watching. By the time she turned the flashlight fully, he was gone. Heart hammering, she told herself it was nothing. Stress, exhaustion, maybe even a trick of the light. But then it happened again. And again. Each time, the figure grew clearer. More defined. And as Ella began to uncover the house's sordid history, letters hidden in floorboards, whispered warnings from the townsfolk, she realized she wasn't alone. Not just in the house, but in Black Harbor. Someone, or something, had followed her here. And it wasn't about to let her leave. Chapter 1. The Stranger in the Rain. The rain came down in sheets, drowning out the hum of Ella Monroe's Jeep as it wound its way through the narrow, twisting roads of Black Harbor. She could barely see 10 feet ahead of her, the windshield wipers battling a futile war against the storm. Her knuckles turned white against the steering wheel, but her jaw was set, determined. "Almost there," she muttered, though the GPS had long since lost signal. The rental agreement promised an easy drive to her new home, but easy didn't seem to be part of Black Harbor's vocabulary. Her headlights caught movement ahead, a flash of pale skin against the dark road. Ella slammed the brakes, her Jeep skidding slightly before coming to a halt. There, in the center of the road, stood a man. He didn't move. Didn't flinch. Just stood there, staring. Ella blinked, her heart pounding in her ears. By the time she looked again, the road was empty. "What the hell?" she whispered, her breath fogging the air. Shaking her head, she eased the Jeep forward, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. Nothing but rain. When she finally reached the house, relief washed over her. It was smaller than she remembered from the photos, an aging Victorian with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but it was hers. A fresh start. Or so she thought. The moment she stepped inside, Ella felt it, a presence. It wasn't the wind rattling the old windows, or the faint smell of mildew that clung to the air. It was something more. Something alive. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out to see a message from an unknown number. "Welcome home, Ella. Don't stay too long." Her pulse quickened. She glanced around the empty room, her fingers tightening on the phone. The rain battered against the windows, drowning out any sound that might have come from the outside. And then the lights went out. In the silence, she swore she heard it, the faintest whisper. A flicker of a voice, saying her name. Ella. Ella stood frozen in the darkness, her breath catching in her throat. The whisper, low, deliberate, seemed to hang in the air, like smoke curling in a room too still. She fumbled for her phone, its weak glow casting long shadows on the walls. The sound of her own heartbeat drowned out everything else as she shined the light into the corners of the room. "Nothing. It's just the wind," she whispered to herself, but her voice sounded hollow. Even she didn't believe it. The flashlight app on her phone barely illuminated the room, but it was enough for her to see the rough edges of the space. Boxes piled haphazardly in one corner, an antique mirror hung crookedly on the far wall. She hadn't noticed that mirror when she first toured the house. A sudden crack of thunder made her jump. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. The light landed awkwardly, pointing toward the mirror. For a moment, Ella swore she saw something, someone in its reflection. A pale figure, watching her. Nope, she muttered, grabbing her phone and turning her back on the mirror. She hurried to the breaker box in the hallway, her sneakers squeaking on the old wooden floors. The house groaned with the sound of settling beams, each creak making her nerves stretch tighter. The breaker box was ancient, its paint peeling and wires looking like they belonged in a museum. Ella squinted at the switches, flipping the main one. Nothing happened. She tried again, harder this time, though she knew brute force wouldn't fix it. The house remained silent, blanketed in darkness. Her phone buzzed in her hand again, startling her. Another message from the unknown number. You shouldn't have come. Her stomach churned. Is this some kind of sick joke? She snapped into the emptiness of the house. But there was no response. Grabbing her coat, Ella decided she wasn't staying here tonight. She'd find a motel, maybe even sleep in her car if it came to that. But as she headed for the front door, she froze. It wouldn't budge. She yanked harder. Nothing. The door that had swung open so easily when she arrived now felt bolted shut. Her phone buzzed again, the vibration trembling against her palm. She didn't want to look. But she did. You can't leave? Ella's legs buckled, and she stumbled back, her breathing shallow. A cold draft brushed past her, carrying the faint scent of something metallic, iron or rust. It made her stomach churn. She turned back to the hallway, and that was when she saw it, a figure standing at the end. Just a silhouette, motionless and unervingly still. It wasn't just the darkness that made it hard to see the figure. It was the way it seemed to flicker, like an old film reel skipping frames. Ella's chest tightened. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The figure moved toward her, slowly at first, then faster with each step. Ella finally found her voice, letting out a strangled scream as she bolted toward the back door. She didn't care where it led, only that it was away from whatever was in the hallway. The old hinges screeched as she threw open the back door and stumbled out into the rain. The icy water soaked through her clothes, but she didn't stop running until she was halfway down the overgrown path that led to the cliffs. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she spun around, expecting to see the figure following her. But there was nothing. Only rain. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below filled the silence, but it didn't comfort her. Something about the roar of the ocean felt wrong. Too loud, too rhythmic, as though it were trying to say something. Ella's phone buzzed again. She hesitated before looking. This time, the message was different. The house remembers? What does that even mean? She shouted, her voice swallowed by the storm. Her fingers tightened around the phone, her mind racing. The house was still there, a looming silhouette in the downpour. For a moment, Ella considered leaving it all behind, her belongings, the job that had brought her here, everything. But then she thought of the questions, the police, the impossibility of explaining why she'd abandoned her new life after less than a day. Steeling herself, she marched back toward the house. She didn't believe in ghosts, or curses, or whatever this was. Someone was messing with her, and she wasn't about to let them win. The door creaked open easily this time, as though it had never been stuck. Ella hesitated on the threshold, dripping water onto the hardwood floor. The air inside felt colder now, heavier. She stepped inside, shivering. She needed to get to the bottom of this, and it started with the mirror. Ella crossed the room, avoiding the flickering shadows cast by her phone. The mirror stood tall and ornate, its silver frame tarnished and worn. The glass shimmered unnaturally, catching the light in ways it shouldn't. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the surface. It was warm. A voice, a woman's voice this time, echoed faintly in her ears, barely audible over the pounding rain outside. "Help me!" Ella yanked her hand back, her pulse hammering in her ears. Her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and pale. And then, for the briefest moment, her reflection smiled. She hadn't. Ella stumbled back, nearly dropping her phone again. The mirror returned to normal, her reflection mimicking her every move. But she knew what she had seen. The house didn't just remember. It was alive. Ella didn't sleep that night. She sat curled up in the corner of the living room, wrapped in a blanket, clutching her phone as though it could ward off whatever lurked in the shadows. Rain lashed against the windows, and the old house groaned with every gust of wind. But none of it compared to the stillness inside, the sense that something, or someone, was always watching. Her reflection's smile haunted her. She replayed the moment over and over, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination, exhaustion playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew better. The warmth of the mirror's surface, the whisper in her ears, they were real. Too real. As the first light of dawn seeped through the rain-streaked windows, Ella forced herself to move. She needed answers. She couldn't stay another night in the house without understanding what was happening. Her first stop was the library. The Black Harbor Public Library sat at the edge of the town square, a squat brick building that looked as though it had been designed to repel anything remotely cheerful. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and mildew, and the librarian, a frail woman with large, owlish glasses, barely glanced up as Ella entered. "Hi," Ella began, her voice still hoarse from lack of sleep. "I'm looking for information on my house. The one on Cliffside Lane." At that, the librarian's eyes snapped to her, sharp and piercing. "You moved into the Sanderson house?" Ella frowned. "Sanderson house? That's what it's called around here," the woman replied, her voice low. "Though most folks avoid talking about it." "Why?" Ella pressed, leaning over the counter. The librarian hesitated, glancing around as though afraid someone might overhear. "There's history there," she said finally. "People who lived in that house didn't tend to stay long. Strange things happened. Tragedies." "Like what?" The woman sighed and gestured toward the rows of old file cabinets lining the back wall. "Start with the local archives. You'll find what you're looking for." Ella thanked her and made her way to the back, her nerves prickling as she felt the librarian's gaze linger on her. She pulled open one of the heavy drawers, flipping through decades of old newspaper clippings and record. At first, it was mundane. A few notices about renovations to the house in the early 1900s, mentions of previous owners selling the property. But as she delved deeper, the tone shifted. "Local man found dead in Cliffside House, 1967. Family of 4 disappears without a trace, 1982. Unexplained fire destroys part of Sanderson House, 1994. Ella's fingers trembled as she read the headlines. Each incident was more horrifying than the last. And each one had something in common. No explanation. No resolution. Just a trail of unanswered questions and shattered lives. She was about to close the drawer when she noticed an envelope tucked behind the files. It was yellowed with age, the edges brittle. Scrawled on the front in faded ink was a name she didn't recognize, Lillian Sanderson. Ella carefully opened the envelope, pulling out a single sheet of paper. It was a letter dated October 13, 1946. "Dear Lillian, you can't stay in that house. It won't let you go. I've tried to warn you, but you won't listen. If you find this, please, get out while you still can. Before it's too late." The signature was smudged, illegible, but the desperation in the words made Ella's stomach turn. Whoever had written this letter believed the house was dangerous. And they'd been right. She shoved the letter into her bag and hurried back to the front desk. The librarian's expression darkened when Ella showed her the letter. "Do you know who wrote this?" Ella asked. The woman shook her head. "Lillian Sanderson lived in that house during the 1940s, but she vanished one night. Just disappeared. Some people say she left town. Others say the house took her." Ella's throat tightened. "Took her?" The librarian's gaze was steady, unflinching. "The house has a way of holding on to people. Don't ignore the warnings. If you're smart, you'll leave before it's too late." But Ella couldn't leave. Not yet. She needed to know more. That evening, Ella returned to the house with a sense of foreboding weighing on her chest. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air thick with the scent of wet earth. She stood on the porch for a long moment, staring at the warped wooden door, trying to summon the courage to go inside. She thought of Lillian Sanderson, of the tragedies that had unfolded within these walls. How many others had ignored the warnings? How many had tried to make this place a home, only to meet the same fate? The letter burned in her pocket as she stepped inside. The house was silent, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but waiting. Ella set her bag down and pulled out the letter. She reread it, her pulse quickening with each word. Why had Lillian stayed? Had she found something here, something that made her believe she could outlast whatever haunted this place? And then, as if in answer, the whisper came again. Lillian. The voice was soft, barely more than a breath, but it sent shivers racing down Ella's spine. She turned toward the source of the sound, the mirror. The glass shimmered faintly, the edges of her reflection distorting. She took a cautious step closer, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. This time, the whisper was clearer, louder. "Help me!" Ella froze. It was the same voice she'd heard the night before, but now it was unmistakable, a woman's voice, pleading. "Lillian?" she asked, barely above a whisper. The mirror's surface rippled like water. And then, faint but undeniable, letters began to appear on the glass, etched by an unseen hand. "Find me." The words on the mirror faded as quickly as they had appeared, but they left Ella trembling. "Find me." The message replayed in her mind, over and over, as though it had been burned into her consciousness. Who was speaking to her? Was it Lillian? Or something far worse, manipulating her, drawing her deeper into the house's twisted web? Ella pressed her fingers to the mirror's surface, half expecting it to ripple again, but it was cold now. Lifeless. She turned away, her eyes scanning the room. The house felt different, charged, as if it were watching her. She tried to shake the feeling, but the silence pressed in on her, heavy and unyielding. Her gaze fell on the antique bureau tucked into the corner of the living room. It was one of the few pieces of furniture left behind, its polished wood marred by years of neglect. Something about it called to her. Slowly, she walked over, her footsteps echoing on the floorboards. The top drawer was jammed, but after a few sharp tugs, it slid open, revealing a collection of yellowed papers and old photographs. Ella's breath caught in her throat as she sifted through them. The photos were of a young woman with dark hair and a haunting smile. Lillian Sanderson. Ella recognized her instantly from a portrait she had seen in the town archives earlier that day. Lillian had been beautiful, vibrant, full of life, a stark contrast to the tragedies that had plagued her home. But as Ella flipped through the photos, her stomach dropped. In the background of each picture, faint and shadowy, was the same figure she had seen in the hallway last night. Always watching. She shoved the photos aside and grabbed one of the letters folded neatly beneath them. The handwriting was neat and precise, the ink faded but still legible. To whoever finds this, the house is a prison. It binds itself to you, feeding on your fear, your grief. It knows your secrets, and it will use them against you. I tried to leave, but the house wouldn't let me. It whispered to me, showing me things I couldn't escape. I thought I could outlast it, but I was wrong. Please, if you're reading this, get out. Burn it to the ground if you must, but don't let it take you too. The letter wasn't signed, but Ella's hands shook as she folded it back up. She didn't doubt the writer's sincerity. Every word rang true, matching the strange occurrences that had already begun to unravel her sense of reality. She was about to reach for the second letter when the air in the room shifted. A sudden coldness swept through, and the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening crack. Ella spun around, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice echoing through the house. The whisper came again, louder this time, echoing from every corner of the room. "Help me!" Ella backed away, gripping the edge of the bureau as though it might anchor her to reality. The whisper grew into a chorus, overlapping voices filling her ears until she clamped her hands over them. "Stop!" she cried. And then it did. The silence was abrupt, jarring. Ella blinked, her vision swimming as she steadied herself. The room was as it had been moments ago, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the tension. With shaking hands, she pulled it out. Another text from the unknown number. The attic. Ella's blood ran cold. She hadn't even considered exploring the attic. The thought of climbing into another dark, confined space made her stomach churn. But the message felt like a dare, a challenge she couldn't ignore. The attic stairs creaked under Ella's weight as she climbed, her flashlight barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint smell of mildew stung her nostrils. When she reached the top, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the latch. Something about this felt wrong, but she couldn't stop now. She pushed open the attic door, and her flashlight revealed a room frozen in time. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs stretched across the rafters. In the center of the room stood a trunk, its lid slightly ajar. Ella stepped closer, her breath fogging in the frigid air. The trunk's contents were a mix of clothing, old books, and trinkets that looked like they belonged in another century. But what caught her attention was a diary, its leather cover cracked with age. She picked it up carefully, brushing off the dust. The name Lillian Sanderson was scrawled on the inside cover. Ella flipped to the first page, the entries written in neat, flowing script. October 1st, 1946. I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Every night I hear whispers, but there's no one there. I told Mother, but she says it's just the wind. I know it's not. Ella's pulse quickened as she read further. Each entry detailed Lillian's descent into paranoia and fear. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. October 12, 1946. The mirror. It shows things that shouldn't be there. I saw a man tonight, standing in the corner of my room. He was smiling, but it wasn't a kind smile. He wants something from me. I don't know what. The final entry sent a chill down Ella's spine. October 13, 1946. I can't leave. The house won't let me. The mirror told me what I must do. If anyone finds this, please understand, I didn't have a choice. Before Ella could process the words, a loud thud echoed from behind her. She spun around, the flashlight beam darting wildly. A figure stood at the attic door, shrouded in darkness. It didn't move. Who are you? Ella demanded, her voice trembling. The figure took a single step forward, and as the light caught its face, Ella's blood turned to ice. It was the man from the photos, the man in the mirror, and he was smiling. Ella's scream caught in her throat as she stumbled backward, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The man's smile widened, impossibly so, stretching across his pale face like a wound. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pull at her, anchoring her in place. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, the movement sharp and unnatural, as if its neck were a rusted hinge. Then it began to advance, slow and deliberate, its bare feet silent on the dusty attic floor. Ella's instincts kicked in, and she threw the flashlight. It struck the figure's chest, passing straight through it before clattering to the floor. For a moment, the attic was plunged into near darkness, broken only by the faint moonlight filtering through the cracked window. The figure flickered, its form wavering like a disrupted projection. And then it vanished. Ella's breaths came in ragged gasps as she scrambled to retrieve the flashlight, her trembling hands barely able to hold it steady. She swung the beam around the attic, searching for any sign of the figure, but there was nothing, only the eerie silence and the oppressive cold that refused to dissipate. The diary lay where she had dropped it, its pages fluttering as though caught in an invisible breeze. Swallowing her fear, she snatched it up and bolted down the attic stairs, slamming the door shut behind her. The sound reverberated through the empty house, but it brought no comfort. Back in the living room, Ella collapsed onto the couch, clutching the diary like a lifeline. She couldn't stay in this house any longer, couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that something malevolent was tethered to it. But as much as she wanted to leave, the cryptic messages, the text, the mirror, the whispers, compelled her to stay. Someone, or something, wanted her to find answers. After forcing herself to calm down, Ella flipped through the diary again, hoping to uncover more about Lillian's final days. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages, careful not to tear the fragile paper. Most of the entries chronicled Lillian's growing fear of the house and the mysterious man in the mirror, but one particular passage stood out. October 10, 1946. I've searched everywhere for the key, but it's as though it doesn't want to be found. Mother told me never to go near the basement, but I think that's where it is. He keeps telling me that's where it all started, and where it must end. Ella's stomach tightened. The basement. She hadn't even considered venturing down there, and now she understood why. If the attic felt oppressive, the thought of descending into the house's bowels sent a wave of nausea crashing over her. She set the diary down and glanced at her phone. It was just after midnight, but there was no way she was sleeping tonight. Not with what she'd seen. The house wouldn't let her rest until she confronted whatever was down there. Gritting her teeth, she grabbed her phone and a kitchen knife, a small, absurd comfort, and made her way to the basement door. It was tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway, partially hidden behind a tattered curtain. The door itself was old and warped, the paint peeling in long strips. Ella hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. For a moment, she thought she heard faint scratching on the other side, like nails dragging against wood. She squeezed her eyes shut, took a deep breath, and twisted the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a set of steep wooden stairs descending into pitch-black darkness. A foul, damp odor wafted up, making her gag. She switched on her phone's flashlight and stepped cautiously onto the first stair. The boards groaned under her weight, each creak amplifying the pounding of her heart. As she descended, the air grew colder, heavier. Her flashlight caught glimpses of the basement. Cobwebs stretched across low beams, broken furniture piled haphazardly in the corners, and old tools rusting on the walls. But it was the large, iron-bound chest in the center of the room that drew her attention. It seemed to pulse in the dim light as though it were alive. Strange markings were etched into its surface, symbols that Ella couldn't begin to decipher. She approached it slowly, her grip tightening on the knife. The chest was locked, but something told her that this was what Lillian had been searching for. She crouched down, running her fingers over the markings. They were rough to the touch, almost sharp, as though carved in a hurry. A faint whisper tickled her ear, so soft she almost didn't hear it. "Open it!" Ella jerked her head around, her flashlight sweeping the room. Nothing. The shadows seemed to press closer, though, as if urging her toward the chest. She shook her head. "I don't have the key," she said aloud, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Find it?" Ella's pulse quickened. The key. She remembered Lillian's diary. Her belief that the key was hidden somewhere in the house. Ella straightened, her flashlight skimming the walls for anything she might have overlooked. Her eyes landed on an old tool cabinet in the corner, its doors slightly ajar. She crossed the room, her footsteps echoing unervingly loud, and pulled the cabinet doors open. Inside were rows of rusted tools, tangled wire, and, at the very back, a small, ornate key. It was heavier than she expected, its design intricate and ancient, as though it belonged in a museum. The whisper came again, now sharp and demanding. "Open it!" Every instinct screamed at Ella to leave the basement, to toss the key and never look back. But something deeper, a morbid curiosity, or perhaps the influence of the house itself, compelled her to return to the chest. She knelt beside it, the key cold in her hand, and slid it into the lock. It fit perfectly, clicking into place with a satisfying turn. The chest creaked as she lifted the lid, and a blast of icy air rushed out, extinguishing her flashlight. Ella gasped, plunging into darkness. For a moment all was silent. Then came the scream. It was piercing, inhuman, and it seemed to erupt from the chest itself. Ella stumbled back, her hands clamping over her ears. The air around her vibrated with the force of it, and the shadows in the basement seemed to writhe and twist. When the scream finally ceased, Ella was left trembling on the floor, her breath ragged. She stared at the chest, now wide open, and felt the pull of something within it, a presence ancient and suffocating. And then, from the darkness inside the chest, a voice spoke. "Ella,